Okay, so you really threw us for a loop with this one. You want to deep dive into excerpts from a 1943 German military manual, Reibert Schützen in 1943.pdf. This is definitely a first for us. What was it about this manual that caught your eye?
Well, it's not every day you get to peek inside the minds of soldiers, right smack in the middle of World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And through their training materials, no less.
Exactly. And I'm curious what we can learn from it. I mean, not just the technical stuff, but the whole mindset, the training methods, even the visual language they used back then. So you're interested in the historical context surrounding this manual for sure, but also how those tactics actually played out in the battles of 1943.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. And we can't forget about the propaganda that might be woven into the manual itself. It's 1943, a crucial turning point in the war. The German military machine was facing some serious challenges on multiple fronts. Stalingrad had just fallen a few months earlier.
Wow, so this manual comes out right in the thick of things,
Yeah.
and it's for the Schützen,
Yeah.
right? The riflemen, the backbone of the infantry.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
They were the guys fighting on the front lines in the trenches. This manual was like their Bible, their guide to surviving and fighting in some of the most brutal conditions imaginable.
So you're saying this manual was like their life. Okay, so let's get into what this lifeline contained. One thing that really struck me is how incredibly comprehensive it is. It covers everything: weapon handling, fieldcraft, combat tactics, even first aid.
It's almost like they crammed an entire military education into a single booklet. And for a good reason, these soldiers, many barely out of their teens, needed to know it all to function in such an intense environment.
So turning a raw recruit into a hardened soldier all through this manual, that leads us to the thing that jumped out at me right away, the visual style. This manual is full of illustrations. Was that common for military manuals back then?
You know, other countries definitely used illustrations,
Mm-hmm.
but the German approach was different. It was almost artistic, and they used a ton of visuals.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's almost like a graphic novel at times.
Exactly. Take, for example, the illustration of the soldier throwing a grenade. The dynamic pose, the look on his face. It's meant to have an impact, maybe even stir up some emotions. What do you think? Was it purely for instruction, or could there be something more to it?
Well, you mentioned propaganda earlier. Could this visual style be part of that? I mean, it definitely grabs your attention.
It's possible.
Mm.
Think about it. Clear visuals make things easier to understand, especially for young recruits who might not have had a lot of education.
Yeah.
But those heroic poses and action scenes, they definitely scream motivation.
So it's like they're saying, look how awesome and powerful our soldiers are, subtly building up that sense of confidence and maybe even superiority.
Right. And that's how visual aids can be used for more than just instruction.
Yeah.
They can shape attitudes and boost morale. This manual wasn't just about teaching technical stuff. It was also about influencing how these soldiers thought and felt.
Okay, so this manual has a dual purpose, practical instruction, and potentially shaping perceptions. Now let's dive into the nitty-gritty. One thing that caught my eye was the level of detail on weapon handling, specifically for the Kar-98K rifle. You're the firearms expert. What stands out to you in this section?
Well, the Kar-98K was the standard German infantry rifle in World War II. And this manual breaks it down completely.
Yeah.
Assembly, disassembly, cleaning, aiming techniques, different firing positions. It's incredibly detailed. They even have illustrations for the proper hand signals to use with your squad. Imagine needing to communicate silently during a nighttime operation, relying on those hand signals to coordinate movements.
Wow, I hadn't even thought about that. It's like they planned for every possible scenario.
Exactly. They needed these soldiers to be adaptable and self-reliant, and that focus on teamwork, that reliance on nonverbal communication, that was crucial for a unit to operate smoothly.
Moving on from weapons, you pointed out the extensive section on fieldcraft. What does that tell us about the German military's approach?
This section is fascinating. It shows how much they emphasized being able to adapt to different environments. We're talking camouflage, building shelters, reading maps, using terrain to your advantage. Imagine being dropped into the forests of Eastern Europe or the deserts of North Africa. You had to know this stuff and know it fast.
This manual wasn't messing around. They expected their soldiers to be resourceful and adaptable.
Right, and that adaptability was key in a war fought across so many different landscapes. It's a timeless skill, really.
Okay, now for the part, I think we've both been waiting for combat tactics. You mentioned earlier that 1943 was a turning point in the war. Does that show up in how the manual approaches combat?
This is where it gets really interesting. The manual goes deep into different tactical maneuvers. Everything from basic formations and flanking maneuvers to reacting to enemy fire and even urban warfare. They were getting these guys ready for anything.
So they weren't pulling any punches.
Not at all. There's a big emphasis on being aggressive, taking the initiative, and never letting up. You see, German military doctrine at that time really favored offensive operations, keeping the enemy on their heels.
So even though the war was starting to turn against them, this manual still reflects that aggressive mindset.
Yeah, but it also shows that they were aware things were changing. Remember, they were facing setbacks, resources were getting tight, and they were fighting on multiple fronts.
So do you think we're seeing a conflict here between their traditional doctrine and the reality of the situation on the ground?
Maybe. But one thing's for sure, they were committed to thorough training no matter the strategic challenges they faced.
Okay, my mind is already blown. And we haven't even gotten to the bayonet fighting section yet. Hand-to-hand combat in the age of machine guns. Seems kind of counterintuitive.
You'd think so, right? But hand-to-hand combat training was still considered essential even in 1943. And this manual doesn't shy away from the brutal realities of war. It dedicates a whole section to bayonet fighting with detailed illustrations of different stances and strikes.
It's a grim reminder that even with all the advances in technology, war sometimes comes down to a brutal, up-close fight for survival. And what about the sections on first aid and handling the dead?
Those sections are really powerful. They give us a glimpse into the human cost of war, the physical and psychological toll it takes on the soldiers.
So this isn't just about becoming a fighting machine. It's about confronting the harsh realities of the battlefield. This manual is really becoming more than just a technical guide. It's like a window into the soul of a German soldier in 1943.
You got it. This manual is packed with insights into the German military mindset of the time. There's a huge focus on discipline, attention to detail, following orders, precisely leaving no room for error. It reflects a very structured, very hierarchical military culture.
It's like they were trying to control everything, even in the chaos of war.
Exactly. But it's not just about blind obedience. There's also a big emphasis on camaraderie and teamwork. The manual constantly reminds soldiers to rely on each other, communicate clearly, and fight as one unit.
So it's like a balancing act. Individual discipline, but within a framework of relying on each other.
Right, because they knew that war isn't an individual effort, it's a collective one. You need trust, communication, and a shared purpose to succeed.
Wow. We've covered a lot of ground already. We've looked at the historical context, the visual style, and even dug into some of the content. This manual is already giving us a lot to think about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But there's one more layer we need to peel back the propaganda aspect.
Yes. You mentioned that at the beginning. We can't forget that this manual was created by the Nazi regime. So how does that propaganda actually show up in the manual?
Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's more obvious. We need to look closely at the language, the imagery, the overall message. And remember, this wasn't created in a vacuum. It was a product of a totalitarian regime that controlled every aspect of life, including the military.
This is getting pretty complex. How do we even start to separate the practical training from the ideological influences?
That's the challenge. But it's also what makes this so interesting. By analyzing the choices they made in this manual, we can maybe start to understand how the Nazi regime tried to shape the minds of their soldiers.
We're definitely going to need to put our thinking caps on for this one. But first, let's take a step back and think about something you said earlier, how this manual compares to those used by other countries in World War II. Was this level of detail and visual storytelling unique to the German military?
That's a great question. And it's one we're going to explore further next time. We'll also dive deeper into that historical context you're interested in and see if we can find any signs of desperation or adaptation creeping into the manual as the war turned against Germany.
We were just talking about how visually striking this German manual is, especially compared to those from other countries during World War II. It really is like they understood the power of images, to really get a point across.
Absolutely. Other countries used illustrations in their manuals, for sure. But the German approach was just something else. The style, the detail, the sheer quantity of visuals is pretty remarkable.
Do you think they had some of the best graphic artists in Germany working on these things, or what? It's like they wanted to make sure this stuff stuck with the soldiers long after they finished reading it.
That's a really interesting idea. Maybe they just instinctively got it. The visuals can be so much more powerful than words.
Yeah.
Especially in the heat of battle, when you really need to make sure those lessons sink in.
Okay, so we've talked about how visually impressive this manual is, maybe even pushing into propaganda territory.
Yeah.
But let's get back to the content itself. You mentioned the historical context of 1943. By that point, the tide was turning against Germany. Did that sense of urgency, that potential shift in strategy, did any of that find its way into this manual?
It's subtle, but if you look closely, you can see hints of it. On the surface, the manual still projects this image of confidence. The illustrations show German soldiers as victorious, overcoming obstacles, defeating their enemies.
It's like they're trying to keep up appearances, project that image of invincibility. even as things are getting tougher for them out on the battlefield.
Exactly. But then you start reading between the lines and you see this awareness of the challenges they were facing. Like there's a big emphasis on resourcefulness, making do with limited supplies, that kind of thing.
And we talked about that whole section on adapting to different environments. Everything from urban warfare to desert survival. It's like they're acknowledging that they might not always have the advantage. They need to be ready for anything.
Precisely. It shows a broadening of their focus, a need to prepare their soldiers for a much wider range of situations, both offensively and defensively.
So maybe this manual, even though it seems to be about individual training, also reflects this subtle shift in Germany's overall military strategy.
Yeah, it's possible.
Yeah.
It's amazing how a document like this can capture those nuances, those turning points in history.
Okay, so we've got this training tool that's also very much a product of its time, reflecting the pressures and realities of war. But you know what I still can't get over? The bayonet fighting section. In a war where tanks and machine guns were everywhere, hand-to-hand combat sounds almost archaic.
I know, right? Talk about a throwback. But you have to remember, trench warfare was still a big part of World War II.
Yeah.
And in those close quarters, anything could happen.
So it wasn't all just pushing buttons and pulling triggers. Sometimes it really came down to a brutal fight for survival, inches away from the enemy.
Exactly. And this manual, with its detailed illustrations of bayonet techniques, it doesn't sugarcoat that reality at all. It's a stark reminder of just how brutal war can be, even in the 20th century.
It makes you wonder about the psychological impact on these soldiers. How did they reconcile these brutal close quarters tactics with all the technological advancements of modern warfare?
That's a question for the ages, isn't it? But it really highlights the complexity of the human experience in war. It's not always about logic and technology. Sometimes it boils down to basic instincts and the sheer will to survive.
Okay, so we've touched on the visual style, the historical context, the shift in combat approaches, and even the brutality of hand-to-hand combat. This manual is really something else.
It is. And the more we dig into it, the more we see that it goes beyond just teaching technical skills. Yeah. It gives us this window into the German military mindset, the values they held dear.
We talked earlier about discipline, precision, following orders without question. Those seem like pretty universal military values, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, you're right. Those are essential for any effective military force. But the way they're presented in this manual, the specific language and imagery, that's where it gets really interesting. It reflects a very particular culture, a certain way of thinking.
You mentioned those passages about complete obedience to superiors, for example.
Right, that unquestioning loyalty was deeply ingrained in the German military tradition. Yeah. And you see it throughout this manual. From the tone of the instructions to the way procedures are laid out, it's all about order and control, even in the chaos of battle.
It's amazing how those values, those cultural nuances can be embedded in something as practical as a military training manual.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It reminds us that we can't analyze these documents in isolation. We have to consider the historical, the social, and the cultural forces that shape them.
So in a way, this manual is like a snapshot of German society in 1943, reflecting the values and the hierarchies of that time.
You could definitely say that. And it makes you wonder how those values instilled through rigorous training might have influenced how those soldiers behaved on the battlefield.
Well, okay, but hold on. We've talked a lot about discipline and obedience, but there's also this recurring emphasis on camaraderie, on teamwork. How does that fit in?
Oh, that's a great point. It's not just about individual skill. It's about understanding that you're part of a unit, relying on your comrades for support and even for survival. The manual constantly stresses the importance of communication coordination, fighting as a cohesive force.
So it's not just about blindly following orders. It's about understanding that your actions impact everyone around you. There's this sense of shared responsibility, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And that sense of camaraderie, that bond between soldiers, that was often the difference between winning and losing.
So we're seeing a more complex picture here. It's not just about blind obedience. It's about balancing individual discipline with the need to work together and to trust each other.
Exactly. And that's what makes this manual so fascinating. It shows us the human side of war, the psychological and emotional factors that were at play alongside the technical and tactical ones.
You know, we talked earlier about potential propaganda, but couldn't you also argue that this visual style, this emphasis on heroic imagery, could also be a way to boost morale?
That's a valid point, especially during a war when soldiers are facing such hardship and danger. Reminding them of their strength and their purpose could be vital for keeping up their morale.
So it's not necessarily black and white, right? It's not just propaganda versus practical instruction. It's more nuanced than that.
Absolutely. And that's what's so great about analyzing historical documents like this. It makes us think critically, consider different perspectives, and really wrestle with the complexities of the past.
Well, we've certainly done a lot of wrestling today. But you know what else really struck me about this manual? The sections on first aid, treating wounds, and even handling the dead. Those seem like really heavy topics to include in a military training guide.
They are. But they're also really important. They remind us that war isn't just about strategy and tactics. It's about individual lives, suffering, and loss.
It's like the manual is acknowledging the emotional impact of war, the toll it takes on the human psyche.
Right. And in a way, it's preparing these young soldiers for the psychological challenges ahead, just as much as the physical ones.
We were talking earlier about the potential for psychological trauma. I can't imagine what these soldiers went through, having to not only fight, but also care for their wounded comrades and even handle the dead.
It must have been incredibly difficult. And these sections of the manual, while practical on one hand, also give us a glimpse into the emotional landscape of war. The resilience and the compassion that must have existed alongside the fear and the brutality.
It makes this whole deep dive feel a lot more personal, doesn't it? We're not just analyzing a document, we're connecting with the human stories behind it.
Exactly. And that's what makes history so powerful. It helps us bridge that gap between the past and the present, to understand and connect with those who came before us, and to learn from their experiences, both the good and the bad.
So as we start to wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you want to leave us with?
Well, I think it's important to remember that no historical document exists in a vacuum. Everything we've talked about today, the technical details, the visual style, the propaganda, it's all a product of its time, shaped by the beliefs and the events of that era.
So context is everything. We can't just take things at face value.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We need to think critically, question our assumptions, and look at things from different angles.
And we have to remember the human element. Behind all the instructions and diagrams, there are real people with real emotions, experiencing the horrors of war firsthand.
That's what makes history come alive. And I think this deep dive has shown us that even in some of the darkest chapters of human history, there are still lessons to be learned, insights to be found, and connections to be made.
You said it. This has been an amazing experience. We started with what seemed like a simple military manual and ended up exploring the complexities of war propaganda and the human condition.
And that's the beauty of a deep dive. You go beyond the surface, uncover those hidden layers, and ask the tough questions.
And hopefully come away with a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Exactly. So until our next deep dive, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep those critical thinking caps on. All right, so we're back, and it's time to address that elephant in the room. We've been deep diving into this German military manual, uncovering some really fascinating insights. But we can't forget the context. This was 1943 Nazi Germany. How do we square what we've seen with the reality of that regime?
That's the key question, isn't it? It's like we've been admiring this beautifully crafted sword, but now we have to face the fact that it was used to do some pretty terrible things.
Yeah. So how do we even start to untangle the propaganda that's woven into this manual? Honestly, it feels kind of like a minefield. It is delicate work. But remember, our goal here isn't to censor history or to shy away from difficult truths. It's about engaging with the past in a critical way.
Okay, so let's put those critical thinking caps on and get into it. Where do we see the propaganda most clearly?
Often it's subtle, embedded in the language and the imagery. For instance, you'll find passages that subtly emphasize the superiority of the German soldier and the perceived weaknesses of their enemies.
We talked about those heroic poses in the illustrations earlier. Are those part of it too?
Oh, definitely. Think about those illustrations where the German soldiers are always depicted as strong and determined, while their opponents are often just faceless or shadowy figures.
I see what you mean. It's classic dehumanization, right? A way to make it easier to justify violence against the enemy.
Exactly. And sadly, it's a tactic that's been used throughout history. But recognizing it for what it is helps us understand the power of propaganda, how it can be used to manipulate people.
Okay, so we're seeing the propaganda. But how do we balance that with the fact that this manual also has a lot of practical information? It's not all just Nazi rhetoric, right?
No, of course not.
Yeah.
This manual was designed to train soldiers effectively, and a lot of the content reflects that. But we have to keep in mind that even those technical aspects are presented through a particular lens, a lens that's shaped by the ideology of the Nazi regime.
So it's like we're trying to filter out the noise and find the signal. We have to always be aware of the context, the underlying agenda, even as we appreciate the technical aspects.
You got it. And that's what makes this deep dive so challenging but also so rewarding. It forces us to confront some tough questions and to really grapple with the complexities of history.
We've definitely doing a lot of grappling today. But you know what else really stood out to me about this manual? Those sections on first aid, treating wounds, and even handling the dead, they seem incredibly personal and sensitive to include in a military training guide.
Those sections really bring home the human cost of war. They remind us that war isn't just about strategy and tactics. It's about individual lives, suffering, and loss.
It's like the manual is acknowledging the emotional weight of war, the toll it takes on the human psyche.
Yeah, and in a way, it's preparing these young soldiers for those psychological challenges they'll face, just as much as the physical ones.
We were talking before about the potential for psychological trauma. I can't imagine what those soldiers went through, having to not only fight, but also care for their wounded friends, and even handle the dead.
It must have been absolutely harrowing. And those sections of the manual, while practical on one level, also give us this window into the emotional reality of war, the resilience and the compassion that must have existed, alongside the fear and the brutality.
It makes this whole deep dive feel much more personal, doesn't it? We're not just looking at a document, we're connecting with the human stories behind it.
Absolutely. And that's the power of history. It allows us to connect the past and the present, to empathize with those who came before us, and to learn from their experiences, both the good and the bad.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key things you want to leave us with?
Well, I think the main thing to remember is that no historical document exists in a vacuum. Everything we've discussed today, the technical details, the visual style, the propaganda, it's all a product of its time, shaped by the ideas and the events of that era.
So context is everything. We
Correct.
can't just take things at face value.
Exactly. We need to think critically, question our assumptions, and consider different points of view.
And we can't forget about the human element behind all the instructions and diagrams. There are real people with real emotions, experiencing the horrors of war firsthand.
That's what makes history so compelling. And I think this deep dive has shown us that even in some of the darkest moments of human history, there are still lessons to be learned, insights to be gained, and connections to be made.
This has been an incredible journey. We started with a simple military manual and ended up exploring the complexities of war propaganda and what it means to be human.
And that's the beauty of a deep dive. You go beneath the surface, peel back those layers, and ask those tough questions.
And hopefully walk away with a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Absolutely. So until our next deep dive, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never stop learning.
And on that note, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the 1943 German military manual. We'll see you next time.